The siren of the patrol car still echoed in my ears when I stopped in front of the cemetery gate. The order was clear: escort an inmate to a family funeral. Cold routine, no room for emotions, just another duty in uniform. But nothing prepared me for what I saw when the coffin was opened. Between white flowers and the heavy silence of the ceremony, my heart almost stopped. The dead man was my former partner, the man who once saved my life, who shared endless patrol nights and secrets that should never have come to light. The shock cut through my chest like an invisible bullet. The inmate, handcuffed at my side, stared at the body with eyes that spoke more than words ever could. I knew in that moment that a truth was buried with that coffin, something that tied us all together. And as the earth waited to cover the face of the man I once called brother, I realized this escort wasn't just another assignment. It was the beginning of a reckoning that could destroy whatever remained of my loyalty. My name has never mattered as much as the badge I wear. I am just another cop among thousands spread across this country, an ordinary face behind the shield, but one who learned early that life on the edge leaves scars no one can see. I grew up in a small town where violence seemed distant, a problem you only saw on television. My father was a truck driver, my mother a teacher, and both believed that a man's character was measured by how well he kept his word. From them, I inherited the conviction that justice is not just an idea, but a daily duty, even when the world insists on proving otherwise. I wasn't the best student, nor the brightest, but I learned how to survive. Maybe that's what pushed me into the police force, the belief that I could give meaning to chaos, bring order where there was only blood and screaming. Time, however, is relentless. Years of patrolling forgotten neighborhoods changed me more than any conduct manual ever could. I saw mothers weeping over children, bodies discarded on the asphalt like garbage, kids who learned how to shoot before they could write their own names. The streets teach fast, and they have no mercy on those who hesitate. In the beginning, I wanted to be a hero, to carry on my shoulders the salvation of those begging for safety. But I soon realized heroes don't last long. The ones who survive are those who learn to build walls around their hearts, walls that keep compassion from bleeding out, walls that isolated me from everyone, except him, my partner. He was the opposite of what I was becoming. Where I saw threats, he saw opportunities. Where I grew hard, he found space for humanity. People said we were an unlikely pair, but the truth is, we were two halves of the same coin. He laughed at what I took too seriously, and in the silence of long midnight shifts, he reminded me that there was still beauty in the world, even if hidden behind sirens. With him, I faced my first shootout, and with him, I learned that the line between justice and vengeance is thinner than most imagine. I carry scars on my body that the uniform doesn't hide, but it's in my mind that the deepest ones live. One night, years ago, we were cornered in an alley, 2 against many. I froze. He didn't. He pulled me out. He fired. He did what had to be done so we both could live. I never thanked him. Never knew how. Since that day, the debt consumed me in silence. I hid behind a cold professionalism while he looked at me, as if he knew I was cracked inside in ways I would never admit aloud. But life outside the streets was no less cruel. The marriage I tried to build collapsed under absences and bottles of whiskey. My daughter grew up learning that her father was always one step away from not coming home. I tried to compensate with gifts, with promises. But deep down, I knew I was failing her the same way I failed everyone who ever tried to reach me. The police consumed me, shaped me, and by the time I realized, I no longer knew where the man ended and the cop began. And yet, despite the wear, despite the exhaustion that weighed down my bones and the memories that haunted me at night, I still believed in something greater than myself. Not for the institution, not for the dusty medals in a drawer, but for the oath I took on my first day, to protect and serve no matter the cost. What no one told me is that the cost would include burying my past with my own hands and seeing my former partner lying in that coffin. I understood it wasn't just about losing someone who was like a brother. It was about losing the part of me that still believed I was worth saving. Behind the badge lives a broken man, held together by memories, by debts unpaid, by guilt never confessed. And now, with him dead, I know the ghosts I thought I had left behind are back, demanding answers. My entire life was built on loyalty, but when the earth falls over that coffin, it will be impossible to ignore that this loyalty carries cracks too deep to heal. The past does not forget, and neither do I. It was a gray morning, the kind of day when even the sun seemed reluctant to appear. I was at the precinct, buried in reports that never stopped coming, pretending for a moment that the world outside wasn't demanding so much of me. The radio on my desk crackled at first, a low hum that could have been ignored, but then the firm voice of dispatch cut through, calling my name with an urgency only those who've lived it can recognize. Officer, you've been assigned a special escort, inmate to be temporarily released for a family funeral. Prepare for immediate transfer. On paper, a simple task, almost banal compared to shootouts and ambushes I'd survived, but something in the tone unsettled me. Funeral, prison, family, 3 words that together carried a weight I couldn't shake. I stood, adjusted the holster at my waist, and walked to the garage. The corridor felt narrower that day, as if the walls themselves knew something I didn't. Outside, the patrol car was ready, glistening under the thin drizzle. The inmate would be brought out in minutes. I drew a deep breath, bracing myself for what should have been just another protocol, but the sensation gnawed at me. This wasn't routine. Not today. The gate clanged open, its metallic echo slicing through the damp air, and the inmate appeared, flanked by 2 prison guards. His steps were heavy, his gaze fixed far beyond us, not fearful, not resigned, but strangely calm, almost rehearsed. His face seemed oddly familiar, but I dismissed the thought. In years wearing the badge, you learn to see types, not individuals, and I had seen that look before. The look of a man dragging chains far heavier than the ones on his wrists. I signed the transfer papers, exchanged quick glances with the guards, and took responsibility for him. The clang of chains against the patrol car's interior rang out like a bad omen. The engine roared, and the radio filled the silence, with fragments of other lives unraveling across the city. Robberies, accidents, bar fights, the usual chaos. But mine that morning was narrowed to one path. Escorting a prisoner to say goodbye. The ride was heavy, the silence thicker than prison walls. I caught his eyes in the rearview mirror, steady, unblinking, as if he already knew something I didn't. I focused on the road, but with every mile the air grew denser, pulling me toward a story that wasn't mine, but that would soon devour me. Dispatch instructions echoed in my head. Maintain protocol. No unnecessary contact. No distractions. Easy to say, impossible to obey when the air itself pressed for answers. And then, a detail cracked everything open. His release papers bore a name, one I knew too well. The same surname as the man who once rode shotgun beside me through endless nights. My partner, my brother in uniform. The blood in my veins boiled, my grip tightening on the wheel until it burned. This wasn't coincidence. Funeral, inmate. That name. The equation was cruel and absolute. The radio buzzed again, but I didn't hear. My mind was stuck on my partner's face the last time I saw him, the conversations we never finished. And now fate was dragging me straight back to him, not as a friend, not as a brother in arms, but as a witness to his final farewell. I hadn't asked for this assignment. It had chosen me. And as I parked outside the cemetery gates, with the inmate silent in the back seat, the truth hit me, like a hammer. This wasn't just a duty. It was a summons from the past, a call I couldn't ignore. The official report would call it an escort, but deep down, I already knew. It was the beginning of something far greater, something that would tear open every ghost I thought I had buried. The cemetery gate groaned as if protesting my arrival. The cold wind cut through my jacket, carrying with it the damp smell of freshly turned earth and flowers left to wilt. I parked the patrol car by the main entrance and sat there for a moment, hands gripping the wheel, as though I could delay the inevitable just by keeping the engine running. The inmate behind me hadn't said a single word, but his silence was deafening, pressing against the metal walls of the car. He didn't look anxious nor restless. His calm was deliberate, almost rehearsed, and that disturbed me more than fear ever could. Outside, small groups of mourners gathered in hushed conversation, faces heavy with grief, their eyes darting with something else, something more tense than sorrow. The air didn't feel like mourning. It felt like a storm waiting to break. Instinctively, my hand drifted toward the holster hidden beneath my coat. Funerals could be dangerous places. They brought together not only family but enemies, unsettled debts, truths that no longer had anywhere to hide. I stepped out of the car, the squeak of the door echoing too loudly in the stillness. The world seemed to pause, eyes turning in my direction. The patrolman, the stranger, the outsider escorting a convict to a farewell that belonged to others. I moved to the rear door, opened it, and the inmate stepped out slowly. The clinking of chains mingled with the distant caw of a crow, the sound scraping the air like a warning. Two local officers approached to help, but I waved them off. This was my responsibility, mine alone. We walked the narrow stone path toward the chapel. With each step, the murmur of voices grew, blending with muffled sobs. And then it hit me. The sight of the coffin at the altar, surrounded by white flowers and flickering candles. My heart stopped. There he was, my partner, my brother in uniform, his face pale, still, forever frozen in silence. The world around me blurred. In that instant, I wasn't the officer on duty. I was just a man standing before the body of the only person who had truly known me, the only one who saw through my walls. The memories came fast, brutal, the nights of laughter in the patrol car, the close calls, the times he saved me when I faltered. Now all of that lay inside a wooden box. I tried to steady myself, but I could feel the eyes on me. Family members I'd never met looked at me with quiet suspicion. Former colleagues stood in the corners, older now but with the same hardened gazes. Some nodded at me, others turned away, unwilling to meet my eyes, as if my presence reopened wounds they had long tried to bury. The inmate asked to approach the coffin. After a tense glance at the other officers, I gave a brief nod. He stepped forward, leaned close, and whispered words I couldn't hear. But I saw his eyes flicker, not with grief, not with tenderness, but with something far more unsettling. Anger mixed with sorrow, and perhaps a glimmer of vengeance. And at that moment, I understood. This funeral wasn't just a farewell. It was a stage. The grief was real, but beneath it, something darker stirred. Secrets, debts, and truths that had been hidden in life were now threatening to surface in death. My first impression was clear and final. I had not walked into a place of rest. I had stepped into a battlefield, silent for now, but ready to erupt. And as I looked one last time at my partner's still face, I knew whatever he had hidden was about to drag me into a reckoning I couldn't escape. The heavy silence inside the chapel felt like a veil ready to tear apart. Every breath echoed too loud in my head, and the distant shuffle of footsteps among the tombs blended with the restrained murmurs of the mourners. But then, as if fate had chosen that exact moment to reveal its hand, the atmosphere shifted. It began with a glance. Two men in dark suits standing at the back. Their clothes were too formal, too sharp for grief, and their posture too rigid for family. I knew the type. They weren't there to mourn. They were there to settle something the grave hadn't buried. My instincts screamed. My hand slid discreetly toward my holster beneath the coat, though my expression remained cold, unreadable. The inmate at my side seemed to sense the same shift. He lifted his chin, inhaled deeply, and locked eyes with the strangers. There was recognition in that gesture, as if an invisible connection had just been exposed before us all. The tension escalated in seconds. One of the men started moving toward the coffin, and the air in the chapel turned to gunpowder. I stepped forward, blocking his path with subtle but deliberate defiance. The whispers stopped. Everyone felt it. This was no longer just a farewell. The man's hand drifted inside his jacket, and my pulse thundered in my ears. I couldn't draw first. Not here. Not in front of my partner's coffin. But I knew, with the sharp clarity of a man who's lived through alleys and ambushes, that the next second could decide whether this room would turn into a massacre. That's when the inmate spoke. His first words since leaving the prison. His voice was steady, resonant. "Not here. He doesn't deserve that." The phrase cut through the tension like a blade. The men froze. One of them stepped back slightly, hesitating, but the other kept his hand near his jacket, a predator reluctant to retreat. Behind me, a woman's sob shifted into a choked cry of panic. Families shifted in the pews, torn between running and staying frozen. I searched the faces of fellow officers, saw conflicting reactions, some ready to move, others rooted to the spot, caught between duty and denial. I moved closer to the stranger, my voice low but firm, sharp enough to slice through the silence. "This isn't the place. If you've got business, it won't be settled in front of him." I nodded toward the coffin. For a heartbeat that felt like an eternity, the man stared at me with cold, hollow eyes, filled with truths I didn't want to know. Then, without a word, he withdrew his hand and leaned back against the wall, though his stare never left me. It wasn't surrender. It was a warning. The inmate leaned over the coffin, resting his chained hand lightly on the polished wood, a gesture that seemed like mourning to others. But I saw it for what it was, a message. His lips moved, whispering something too low to hear, but when he looked back up, his eyes burned with something I couldn't mistake. Not grief, not loss, but rage tangled with regret. It struck me then. I wasn't just escorting a prisoner to say goodbye. I was standing at the center of a web woven long before I realized it existed. My partners, death, the men in black, the inmate's strange calm, all threads of a truth that was beginning to unravel before me. The action hadn't erupted into violence, but it didn't need to. The silence itself had become explosive. My veins pulsed with fire, every sense sharpened. I knew then what others might have missed. The funeral was no ending. It was only the beginning, and whatever secrets my partner had taken to the grave were about to drag me into a story where the rules of the badge would mean nothing at all. The moment the inmate leaned over the coffin seemed ordinary to anyone watching from afar. A man in chains bowing his head, whispering what could have been a prayer, a final goodbye. But I was too close not to notice. His lips moved with restraint, but the words weren't of mourning. They were fragmented phrases, cryptic, almost coded, and then one line pierced through me like a blade. He carried everything, until the end. The air around me grew thin. My eyes locked on my partner's face, pale and still, and for the first time I saw what I had ignored. The mark along his cheek, barely hidden under layers of makeup, wasn't the kind of blemish that illness or natural causes would leave. It was jagged, deep, unnatural, something violent. His death was no accident, no quiet departure. The story we'd been told didn't match the truth lying before me. I staggered a step back, trying to steady my breathing, my mind snapping into the cold, methodical gears of an investigator. The inmate lifted his eyes, not looking directly at me, but close enough, and whispered again, "You know it wasn't chance." His tone wasn't taunting. It was final, certain. The words detonated inside me, even as I felt the weight of 100 eyes in the chapel watching every move I made. And then, the revelation struck harder than any bullet. The priest began reciting prayers, and a fresh wreath was carried closer to the coffin. My gaze fell on the ribbon tied around it. The name inscribed wasn't from family, nor from any friend. It was from a criminal organization, a name I knew too well, one that my partner and I had fought for years to dismantle. The enemy, the same men who had marked our nights with blood and fear. They had left a tribute at his coffin. My stomach churned. The ground beneath me felt unsteady. That ribbon was no act of respect. It was a statement, proof that the man lying before me, the man I trusted with my life, was bound to them in ways I had never imagined. The inmate's faint smile confirmed it. His eyes seemed to say what he didn't need to. Your brother in arms wasn't who you thought he was. The conflict tore me apart. Was my partner playing both sides? Had he been their pawn, or had he sacrificed himself, infiltrating their world alone to shield me from the truth? The questions spun in my head like knives, carving into every memory we had shared. The laughter, the silences, the moments I believed were ours alone. Were they genuine? Or just part of a mask he wore? My blood ran hot, shame and rage tangling with grief. Part of me wanted to tear the place apart, scream that it was a lie, that the man in that coffin could never have betrayed the badge. But the signs were undeniable. The scar, the whispers, the wreath with their name in gold letters. The pieces were assembling into a picture I had never wanted to see. Around me, the chapel dimmed, the words of the priest fading into noise. The only sound I truly heard was the pounding of my own heart. The coffin, the inmate, the wreath, everything became part of one cruel truth. The man I had trusted above all else had lived a life shrouded in secrets. That was the moment it all shifted. My partner's death wasn't the end of a brotherhood. It was the opening of a door to shadows I had never dared to step into. And I knew I couldn't walk away. The funeral wasn't closure. It was an invitation to a reckoning that would demand everything I had left. The weight of that revelation didn't hit me like a sudden gunshot. It seeped in slowly, corrosive, like poison running through my veins, spreading without mercy. I stood there, staring at the coffin, sweat dripping cold down my back despite the chill in the chapel. The image of my partner, the man who saved me, who laughed with me in the darkest nights, who I once called my brother, was now tangled in a cruel question. How much of him did I ever really know? For years, I clung to the certainty that if there was one pure soul in the chaos of the streets, it was his. I was the skeptic, the hardened one, the one who saw threats in every shadow. He was different. He found humanity even in criminals, in places where I only saw danger. But now, that faith was crumbling. What if he saw humanity because he was closer to those men than I ever imagined? What if every smile, every joke, every word of hope was covering a secret life I never saw? Memories came flooding back like knives. That night in the alley, I froze, ready to die, and he pulled me out, firing with precision, saving us both. I always thought it was bravery, loyalty, but now the memory twisted. What if that ambush wasn't meant for me but for him? What if he already knew it was coming, and he'd been playing a different game all along? The thought poisoned everything we shared. I scanned the room, family in tears, colleagues with guarded eyes, the two men in black standing like shadows in the back, and then the inmate, chained but strangely calm, watching me with eyes that told me he knew the truth I was trying so hard to deny. It was unbearable. Loyalty had been my compass, first to my family, then to the badge, but above all, to him. Now, that loyalty cut into me like a blade. If I stayed loyal to his memory, I would have to bury these questions forever. If I stayed loyal to the truth, I might destroy the image of the man who was my brother. The anger rose fast, boiling with grief. Anger at him for leaving me with riddles I could never solve. Anger at myself for being blind, for never noticing the cracks in his mask. Anger at the world for reminding me that nothing is ever black and white, that even the purest souls are marked with shadows. And in the middle of it all, my daughter's face flashed in my mind, the way she once asked me why I was never really present. Her words hit harder than any bullet. "You're always somewhere else, Dad. Even when you're here, you're not." What would I leave her if I died tomorrow? Oh, legacy of silence, of unanswered questions, of secrets buried under duty. Was I becoming the very same ghost I now accused him of being? The conflict tore me apart. I wanted to defend him with everything I had, to honor every night on patrol, every bullet dodged, every laugh in the dark. But the truth was relentless, burning inside me. Maybe he wasn't who I thought he was. Maybe honoring him meant exposing him. And so I stood there, ripped in two. On one side, the man who believed in, brotherhood, who owed his life to a friend now lying cold. On the other, the cop who couldn't ignore evidence, who knew silence could make him complicit. The badge on my chest felt heavier than ever. not as a shield, but as a chain. That was the real war, the one no bullet could win. Not against criminals, not against the streets, but against myself. The line I swore to defend wasn't straight anymore. It was jagged, blurred, cutting me in half. And I knew as I stared at the coffin that sooner or later I would have to choose which part of me would survive, the loyal brother or the relentless seeker of truth. My breathing grew heavier with each passing second, as if the air in that chapel had turned to lead. My body was coiled, ready to react, but there was no clear enemy. Only ghosts, shadows, and truths I wasn't ready to face. The scene before me was a crossroads. On one side, the coffin of my partner, carrying with it every memory of loyalty, every night of laughter and survival. On the other, the inmate, chained but steady, his silence dripping with truths I could no longer ignore. And beyond them, those men in black, standing like sentinels of a secret far larger than me. My instincts as a cop screamed, maintain order, follow the protocol, keep the peace. But the man inside me, the friend, the brother, knew that looking away now would be betrayal. Betrayal of him, betrayal of myself, betrayal of everything the badge once meant to me. The coffin wasn't just a coffin anymore. It was a door, and I had to decide, close it forever, or step through it into the unknown, no matter the cost. And so I chose. I would not be complicit in silence. I would not let his memory be reduced to flowers, speeches, and a neat report buried in the archives. If there were secrets here, and I knew in my bones there were, I would drag them into the light, even if they destroyed me. I leaned closer to the inmate, my voice low but cutting through the air like steel. You're going to tell me everything. Not here, not now, but you will. His eyes gleamed, a faint acknowledgement that sealed something between us. He didn't argue, didn't resist. He simply nodded, the faintest tilt of his head, as if to say, I've been waiting for this. But there was still the matter of the men at the back. I walked toward them, every muscle in my body tense, my footsteps echoing like gunfire on the wooden floor. I stopped just close enough for them to hear my voice, firm but quiet, sharp as a knife. Whatever business you think you have here, it won't happen today. If you have respect for him, show it now. One of them, taller, squared his shoulders and locked eyes with me. For a moment, the world froze. His stare was a blade pressing against mine, testing, threatening. I felt the weight of violence hanging in the air, waiting for a single wrong move. But then, after a beat that felt endless, he looked away. His arms crossed over his chest, a retreat disguised as arrogance. It wasn't surrender. It was a warning. I returned to the coffin, my hands trembling but hidden beneath the fabric of my jacket. I placed a hand lightly on the wood, leaning in so no one else could hear. If you lied to me, I'll find out. If you protected me, I'll honor it. But I won't stay in the dark. The words were as much a promise to him as they were a vow to myself. The decision had been made, the path chosen. From that moment forward, I would chase the truth, even if it meant tearing down the memory of the man I once called brother, even if it meant tearing myself apart. The funeral carried on, the priest's voice blending into the murmurs of grief. Then came the sound, the coffin being sealed, the hammering of metal locks, final and brutal, echoing like distant thunder. Everyone else heard the end of a life. I heard the beginning of a hunt. That was my moment of decision. To others, I was still just a cop escorting a prisoner. But inside, I had crossed a line. The funeral wasn't closure. It was the opening move in a game I could no longer refuse to play. And I knew, as sure as the blood in my veins, that the truth waiting ahead would demand everything I had left. The sound of the coffin being sealed rang like a gunshot. Final, dry, merciless. Families wept in silence, fellow officers stood stiff as statues, but what lingered in the air wasn't just grief. It was the weight of something about to erupt. I had already made my choice, and I could feel it burning in my eyes. Everyone around me seemed to sense it too. The first to react were the men in black. One of them shifted toward the chapel doors, planting himself there as if waiting for someone to make a move. The other stayed where he was, arms crossed, his presence as threatening as a loaded gun. The message was clear. I had crossed into territory where I wasn't welcome. The inmate, still chained at my side, looked different now, lighter, almost satisfied. His eyes carried a strange mixture of sorrow and triumph, like my decision had been exactly what he'd been waiting for. Without words, an unspoken pact was forged between us. He had answers, and I needed them. But that meant I was tied to him now, bound to a man who lived on the wrong side of the law. My fellow officers were another story. Some gave me quick, stiff nods of condolence. Others avoided my eyes entirely. I could see it in their faces. They knew I wouldn't let this go, that I would dig where no one wanted me to. Their silence wasn't respect. It was suspicion. And suspicion spreads fast in a force built on loyalty and secrecy. Then came the order from command. As the last words of the funeral faded and I led the inmate back toward the patrol car, my radio crackled. "Officer, after delivery, report to headquarters for full debrief." It wasn't a request. It was a demand, clipped and cold. They already sensed something in me had shifted. Maybe they feared I'd seen too much. Maybe they just wanted to make sure I stayed on the official script. Either way, I knew what waited for me. Pressure, questions, maybe even a warning. As the coffin was lowered into the earth, family members clung to it, some collapsing, others screaming their grief into the gray sky. I stood apart, the outsider, the man escorting a prisoner, the man who had once called the dead brother. Eyes turned toward me, weighing me, expecting me to stand still, to bow my head, to swallow my grief in silence. But inside, the grief had already turned to something else. Anger, determination. When I loaded the inmate back into the car, I caught sight of one of the men in black. He was on the phone, his gaze fixed on me. He didn't flinch, didn't look away. The meaning was unmistakable. I was marked now. Not as an officer, not as a mourner, but as a threat. The drive back to the prison was heavy, suffocating. And then the inmate broke the silence with a calmness that chilled me. "You'll want answers, I know, but be careful. What you dig up, you may not be ready to face." My grip on the wheel tightened until my knuckles turned white. I didn't respond. Couldn't, but he was right. The dominoes had already started to fall one by one, and I was right in their path. The first consequence was clear as day. I had lost the right to mourn. From here on, there was no room for tears, only the fight. My partner's death had opened a door, and stepping through it meant I carried a target on my back. The others had buried him in that cemetery. But me, I carried him with me, in the ghosts of every question, in the weight of every secret, and in the knowledge that if I wasn't careful, the next body lowered into that same ground would be mine. Night had already fallen by the time I pulled the patrol car up in front of the prison. The entire drive back had been swallowed in silence. Just the hum of the engine and the hiss of the radio filling the space. But I knew I couldn't just hand him back to the guards and walk away, pretending the funeral had been routine. I was already too deep, my chest burning with questions that refused to stay buried. I requested a few minutes alone with him, citing protocol. The guards gave me suspicious looks, but they agreed, maybe because they could see something in my face that didn't allow for refusal. I led him into a cold, empty room, lit only by a single swinging bulb that cast long, uneven shadows across the peeling walls. I shut the door, and the tension I'd been holding finally broke. "What did you mean back there?" My voice came out harsher than I intended. "What were you hinting at about him?" The inmate gave me a bitter smile, one that carried more pain than mockery. "I wasn't hinting. I was telling you the truth. He wasn't the man you think he was." The words hit me like glass shattering. "You didn't know him. You weren't there on the nights he pulled me out of hell, when bullets cut the air and we came out alive only because of him." He leaned forward, his eyes sharp, steady. "That's exactly why you can't see it. You only saw the version he wanted you to see. The rest, he hid even from you." My fists clenched on the table. I wanted to call it lies, manipulation, but deep down, the doubt was already rooted. "Then say it. Tell me what I don't know." He inhaled, weighing the risk, and then spoke in a low, deliberate tone. "That coffin wasn't just filled with a dead man. It was filled with secrets. Your partner had an arrangement with those same men you saw at the chapel. He wasn't only a cop, he was a piece in their game." I felt my blood boil. "You're lying. If I were, you wouldn't be here, demanding answers." He leaned back, almost satisfied. He thought he could balance both sides, collect information, play both roles, protect you in the process. But no one walks away clean from that. No one. My heart thundered like a drum. Part of me wanted to slam the table, storm out, and erase every word he'd said. But another part, darker, sharper, whispered that it all made sense. Too much sense. "And you? Where do you fit into this?" For the first time, I saw something real flash in his eyes. Pain. I was the trade, the sacrifice. I was locked up for a crime I didn't commit. And he knew. He let it happen. Because that was the price of keeping their deal alive. The room spun. My partner, my brother in uniform, condemning an innocent man to protect his secret world. My throat burned with rage and disbelief. But the clues, the scar on his face, the wreath, from the crime syndicate, the whispers I overheard, were no longer just coincidences. They were threads of the same rope tightening around my neck. The inmate leaned forward again, lowering his voice until it was almost a whisper. "You think the coffin closed the story, but his death is only the beginning. If you really want to honor him, find out what he was hiding. Only then will you know who he truly was." I stared at him, silent, my insides torn apart. I had walked into that room demanding a quick answer, a clean cut. Instead, I left with something heavier than ever, a mission. Not official, not written in reports, but etched deep into me. That night, I finally understood. The real farewell to my partner hadn't happened at the cemetery. It was only starting now, and the only way to truly let him rest would be to dig up the truths he tried so hard to take with him to the grave. I walked out of that room carrying a weight no one could see, but one that crushed me all the same. The night air outside the prison was sharp against my skin, but it was nothing compared to the storm raging inside me. Every step I took away from those walls felt like I was leaving behind not just an inmate, but a version of myself that no longer existed. I had entered the prison as a grieving cop, but I left it as a man consumed by doubt. Everything I believed in, every bond of loyalty that had carried me through the years, was unraveling. Sitting alone in the patrol car, I killed the engine and let the silence press in. The rearview mirror reflected a face that barely looked like mine anymore. Drawn, hollow, carved not just by years of service, but by the memories that never let me sleep. For so long, I thought the badge was a shield. Follow the rules, honor the oath, and you'll stay on the right side. But the badge doesn't protect you from the truths that come from within. It doesn't shield you from the realization that the line you swore to defend isn't straight at all. It bends. It blurs. It cuts through you until you bleed. My partner's ghost haunted me. The laughter, the silences, the moments that kept us alive. Now they were poisoned with questions. Was he a traitor hiding behind brotherhood? Or a man who sacrificed everything to protect me from shadows too heavy to bear? Every memory twisted into doubt, and the more I tried to hold on to the man I knew, the more he slipped away, leaving behind a stranger I never really saw. And then, in the middle of that torment, came the image of my daughter. Her eyes when she told me I was never really present, that even when I was home, I wasn't there. Her words echoed like a verdict. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was too busy chasing ghosts, burying myself in the uniform, clinging to a loyalty that blinded me from the truth. If I died tomorrow, what would I leave her? A father's shadow? Another grave full of unanswered questions? That was when something shifted. In the ashes of grief and rage, something new began to burn. I understood that blind loyalty can be as dangerous as betrayal. That to honor someone isn't to worship their memory. It's to face their truth, no matter how much it hurts. If my partner had lived in shadows, then I had to walk into them. If he carried secrets, then it was my duty to uncover them, not just for me, but for everyone who believed in him. It wasn't a revelation that came with light or clarity. It came like a smoldering coal in my chest, slow and relentless. I could no longer be just another officer checking boxes, filing reports, keeping my head down. That man was gone. What remained was someone who had to dig, to confront, to bleed if necessary, because now I knew pretending was worse than dying. My partner's death had been the spark, but the fire it lit was mine. Before, I lived for loyalty, clung to it like a lifeline. Now, I would live for truth, even if it broke me, especially if it broke me. Because I realized then that the greatest enemy we face isn't out on the streets. It isn't the gangs or the bullets or the alleys that reek of blood. It's inside of us. It's the lies we accept to keep moving, the silence we choose so we don't have to question what we love. That night, sitting in the dark with only the reflection of my weary face staring back at me, I made a second oath. The first was the one I took with the badge, to protect and serve. The second was one no one else would ever hear, carved deep into my soul, to uncover the truth, whatever it costs, even if it destroys me. Because only in truth, brutal, merciless, raw, could I finally find a way to live again. Dawn found me still awake, my eyes bloodshot from a night spent wrestling with the storm inside me. The city yawned itself awake in slow motion, but I was already carrying the weight of a war fought in silence. It was time to close the case on paper, to type out the cold, bureaucratic summary that would reduce everything to a few sterile lines. Escort completed without incident. Inmate returned to custody. Funeral carried out as planned. But as the cursor blinked on the screen, I realized those words were a lie. Nothing about that day had been routine. It wasn't an escort. It was an unraveling. It wasn't a funeral. It was an opening wound. The brass wanted efficiency, not truth. They wanted the file clean, concise, forgettable. And I could have done it in minutes, handed it over, and buried the day with the rest of the paperwork. But my hands hesitated. Every instinct told me the official record wasn't the real conclusion. I wrote the version they expected, yes, but inside I knew I was signing off on a fabrication. The truth wasn't in the report. It was in the silence, in the scar on his face, in the wreath left by men who should have been our enemies. When I printed the final copy, I made another choice. I would write a second report, one not meant for the files, one that would never pass through command. A private dossier built from memory and instinct, collecting, every look, every whispered word, every sign I caught that day. Because if the system wanted to bury the truth, I couldn't let it. Not this time. The official conclusion came with the nod of my superior. He skimmed the pages, tapped a pen against his desk, and said flatly, "Good work, officer. Now move on." Move on. As if grief could be shelved, as if suspicion could be filed away. The words cut deeper than any reprimand, because I knew I couldn't move on. The funeral hadn't closed anything. It had cracked open something I couldn't ignore. Later that day, I drove back to the cemetery. No duty, no chains, no command. Just me and the wind weaving through the headstones. The fresh mound of dirt over his coffin still looked raw, unsettled. Flowers lay scattered, some already wilting. I stood there for a long time, the silence pressing harder than any crowd ever could. I didn't ask for answers. I knew they wouldn't come easy. Instead, I whispered a vow. I don't know who you really were, but I'm going to find out. That was the real conclusion of the case. Not the one inked in black and white, but the one carved into me that day. Nothing was over. His death wasn't the end of our story. It was the beginning of mine. As I drove away, my eyes caught the glint of the badge lying on the dash. I'd once seen it as a shield, clean and bright, proof I was on the right side. Now it looked different. Still a shield, but also a shackle. It bound me to the institution, but it also reminded me of my duty to truth, no matter how much the institution wanted silence. On paper, the occurrence was closed. Case finished, file archived. but I knew better. The truth was alive, breathing, clawing its way up from under the dirt, and it was pulling me with it. The conclusion was bitter, but undeniable. My partner was gone, but his secrets weren't. They had become my burden, my mission. And I understood then that I wasn't just a cop anymore. I was a man walking into the shadows, hunting answers that could tear down everything I thought I knew. The world would see a closed case, but I knew the truth. This was only the beginning. I returned to the cemetery days later when the crowds were gone and silence ruled among the graves. There were no more speeches, no uniforms lined in rows, no fresh flowers covering the mound. Only the cold wind rattling through the trees and a few wilted petals clinging to damp earth. I stood before his grave, and the weight in my chest wasn't just grief. It was anger and gratitude twisted together in a knot that would never loosen. Minutes passed like hours as I searched for meaning in what was left of our story. All my life, I believed loyalty was a straight line, unwavering, absolute. Follow it, and you'd never lose yourself. But here, staring at the soil above my partner's coffin, I finally understood the truth. Loyalty is a crooked road, full of turns and shadows. He had saved me, laughed with me, shared the kind of silence only brothers in arms can share. And yet, he carried secrets I may never uncover. That doesn't erase what he was to me, but it also doesn't allow me to worship him blindly. What I learned that day was that we are all made of contradictions, truth and lies, bravery and shame. The badge doesn't purify us. The uniform doesn't erase our cracks. Before anything else, we are men, and men stumble, fall, make deals with themselves just to survive in a world that keeps crushing down on them. My partner was both hero and perhaps accomplice, light and shadow all at once. And maybe that's what hurts the most, realizing even those we admire most are as flawed as we are. On my way back to the car, my daughter came to mind. I thought about the weekends I missed, the empty promises, the way her eyes had once accused me without words. If I kept hiding behind this uniform, burying myself in duty and silence, she would grow up with the same questions that now haunted me about my partner. And one day, she would stand over my grave wondering who her father really was. That thought cut deeper than any bullet. That's when I understood. His death wasn't just an ending. It was a warning, a reminder that survival isn't just about making it through the streets. It's about surviving ourselves, surviving the lies we tell, the truths we hide. I didn't want to leave my daughter with ghosts. I wanted her to know that, despite my flaws, I fought for truth until the end. As I drove away, the cemetery fading in, the rearview mirror, I made my final vow. Not to the command, not to the institution, but to myself. Never again would I close my eyes to the truth, no matter where it came from. Because in the end, truth is all that remains when everything else is gone. That was the lesson I took from my partner's funeral. He may have taken secrets to the grave, but he left me something greater. The certainty that truth always finds a way to breathe. And it's up to us to decide. Bury it with the dead, or have the courage to dig it out. If this story struck you, subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments which part hit you the hardest. Your voice is what keeps these stories alive.